This is episode 587 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I'm very pleased to be joined this week by former U.S. Representative and New Mexico Representative Yvette Herrell. Welcome to the show, Yvette.
Hey, Paul, thanks for having me. It's been a long time, so it's good to be back with you.
Yeah, well, we've certainly seen each other in various events and at various activities over the last several years, but we really got to know each other and work more closely together when you were a state representative representing the Alamogordo area in the New Mexico legislature. And
Yep.
what were you there for? 3, 4 terms?
4 terms.
4 terms. And of course, you then moved on to Congress, and it's been a interesting journey to say the least. You ran and lost, ran and won, and then lost again. Is that correct? I'm trying to get the.
Uh, Lost, won, lost.
Yes. Okay. And so now you're coming back
Yes.
for Congressional District 2,
Yeah.
which has been revised. And obviously, that was a big controversy and a challenge. And I think it's safe to say had a pretty significant impact on your reelection, your attempt to get elected, but still very much a competitive seat. And I know you're hoping to get back up to Washington, D.C. So Gabe Vasquez is the incumbent. He
Yeah.
now holds that seat. The entire delegation in New Mexico is blue, and I'm sure you'd like to return some balance to that delegation. So just talk about anything you want to share about uh, your desire to get back to Washington and why you think you're better for this job than Vasquez.
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely right in that the redistricting was a challenge, and not just for us, but for really the state of New Mexico. As you recall, they swung at basically 16 points. They took a lot of the red counties out and then gave me South Valley and West Albuquerque. But at the end of the day, to me, Paul, we're about New Mexico. We're about America. We're about doing what's right in terms of the voice and how we carry our concerns and our policy voices to Washington, D.C. And it is unfortunate that we don't have one conservative voice in the entire delegation. There is no balance. So after 2022, we lost by just 1,300 votes in a district that I'm sure everybody expected us to lose by, 5 or 10 points. And it was a prayerful decision to go back, but I knew two things. I thought, we don't have a way now to have somebody who will really stand up and advocate for our energy, for our ag, for the border. And I also had amazing people that worked for me both in DC and in New Mexico. So I knew I lost some great employees. And you'll be happy to know that we got everybody placed in a good place. But it's just, there's no governance right now. It's not really fair to have energy sector or ag sector or all these rural communities now that are kind of lumped into Albuquerque. The needs are different between Albuquerque and, say, Deming or Lordsburg or Reserve, but it's important that we develop those relationships and continue to ensure that we get those voices to Washington, D.C. and have a seat at the table.
Yeah, and I don't think I'll get any pushback on this to say that Brian Egolf, the Speaker of the House then that really ran the redistricting, he said at the time that he was going to come after you. He did come after you. He did so in a way that really attempted to split the Albuquerque vote 3 ways to uh, increase its impact and decrease the potential impact of rural New Mexico, certainly in your district 2 as
Yep.
well as 3. It was kind of an Albuquerque sandwich. There was the
Hmm.
lump of Albuquerque in the middle, and that was its own, broadly speaking, congressional district. And then you had the northern and the southern seats, and
Right.
you were, of course, in the southern seat. So, um, obviously, one of the main concerns, though, is the border.
Yep.
And so let's jump right into some of those policies because certainly when you look at what is being discussed in Washington, The border is very critical. And before I hand it over to you, obviously most of the film, the sites you see are from Texas. I'm sure you hear from ranchers and people in New Mexico that are concerned about the border. But
Yeah.
what's your take on that big issue, and where's Vasquez on the border?
Yeah, border's been a big issue. And in fact, I know when I was in Congress, you and I had actually talked about it. Day one, President Biden got into office, signed executive orders, and really undid the border policies that had worked so well under the previous administration, under the Trump administration. We got rid of Remain in Mexico. We got rid of the catch and release. We got rid of the, Title 42 under this administration. And for 2 years while I served in Congress, when we started to see the floodgates open and the crossings and just the people coming to this border and then coming to this country illegally, they skyrocketed. And I met with the president of Guatemala while I was a member of Congress, who said, when you have a president like President Joe Biden, who ran on essentially saying we're going to have an open border policy with no consequences, the impacts to not only the American people, but to the countries around the globe, really, who are seeing, their work age people, their young adults coming to America for a better life. The sad thing is, I think we can all say that, yes, we appreciate our immigration process. We appreciate people that want to come here to better themselves, but we have laws and we have a way to do that. Now, does that process need improvement? Of course. But to now see that we've got over, 200 countries of people who have come to this country illegally. We know that people on the terrorist watch list have come to America illegally. And we have every single one of our congressional members who voted no on the Secure the Border Act. Now we're seeing, the fentanyl crisis, the human trafficking. Recently, the college student in Georgia that was murdered. We're seeing this uptick in costs of goods and services, the costs for every single American to take care of, house, transport, medicate, all of these people that are coming here illegally. I mean, just in the month of December, we had 10 times the number of illegals coming across the border as Obama saw in his tenure as our president. I mean, it makes no sense, and I'm grateful the American people are starting to realize this is not working. And in Congress, multiple times, Secretary Mayorkas told everybody, we have operational control of the border. We have operational control. There's not a crisis. There's not a problem. And then fast forward, 9 months now before a presidential election, he's on the news today saying there's a crisis at the border. President Biden's blaming Congress. Well, this is squarely President Biden's fault. It was the policies, the decisions that he made, the executive orders, the lack of enforcement of securing our border for the last 3 years, and now suddenly it's Congress's fault. And I think the American people, and certainly the people of New Mexico, are smarter than that.
Now, the Senate passed a bill on the border that I think a lot of conservatives were not fans of, so to speak. Certainly, Speaker Johnson has not even brought it up. What's your take on that specific piece of legislation?
Yeah, I think you're referring to the legislation that would secure the border, but also has a great deal of funding in it for Ukraine. And, that's been the stickler because we've spent billions of dollars sending those resources over to Ukraine. And the conversation has really shifted and began to shift when I was in Congress, that people were starting to realize, hey, we're sending more money and we're protecting borders that, are not American borders before we're actually securing and keeping the American people safe. And so there's been a stickler, and there's quite a few members of Congress that don't think that that is the right way to go, that we need to secure our own southern border, or at the very least have enough resources and ability to secure the southern border. Because at the end of the day, Paul, everybody knows it's a national security issue. We now know that we don't know who all is in this country. People are growing weary of seeing billions of dollars being spent in the Ukraine war, in Israel and all these places, and where I absolutely support Israel and where my colleagues in Washington do as well. Gabe, however, voted against sending aid to Israel. But we've got to be serious about taking care of our border now. And I think the crisis has just become so alarming that every state is now a border state. And what I think is great is that Governor Abbott and DeSantis, both by sending migrants all over the country. They took a lot of heat for that, but I think it was really an eye opener for people around the country. And now we see Democrat, governors and mayors that are saying, whoa, we've got a crisis in our own communities, and it doesn't compare to what we see on our southern border. And the one thing that's sad is now, because our delegation is all blue, we don't have an advocate talking for the farmers, the ranchers, the communities. The loss of livestock, water lines, personal property that's being damaged, the trash and debris that's being left on the southern border. We took 7 trips down to the border when I was in Congress, and 3 of those were Codels, where we took members of Congress so they could see what our crisis was. We invited the vice president to come to New Mexico. We implored the governor to re-engage the National Guard and deploy them back to our border. Of course, all that fell on deaf ears, but we were at least the voice and the advocate to keep people engaged on what was happening in New Mexico, because we are seeing a great deal of foot traffic.
And those foreign aid packages have been tied together. You've got Ukraine and Israel. Do you have concerns or support both, one or the other? Prefer not to say at this point. What's your take on those foreign aid packages? Because they've obviously been tied to the border in a political way.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate, because I actually think we can differentiate now, and we should separate those. I think we have a huge responsibility, not only constitutionally, but again, because it's a national security issue, we should be securing our own border first. We need to be taking care of the American people first and prioritize the people of New Mexico, the people of America, our neighborhoods, our kids. We need to prioritize that. I think the aid packages need to come completely separate, but that's what they do in Washington, D.C. They tie it all together. So it makes it a very tough vote for some, a very easy vote for others. But just in general conversations that I'm having around the district, people want to see America's borders secured first, and then have a different piece of legislation or a different funding mechanism put into place for Ukraine and Israel. And no doubt, I mean, by and large, the people in the district are very supportive of supporting Israel. They do call into question the amount of money that's come to Ukraine. And it's just unfortunate that we can't just separate it all out. It's kind of like that log rolling. In the state of New Mexico, that's illegal, where you put multiple facets into a bill where it covers 10 or 15, different items, everything but the kitchen sink. In New Mexico, that's illegal. You have to have a single issue bill. Not so in Washington, D.C., and that's how they get these bills passed that are usually do more harm than good.
Did you get to know Speaker Johnson, or he was just Representative Johnson at the time? But did you get to know him while you were in Washington? 435 folks, although figure a half of them you probably know a lot better because they are
Sure.
Republicans. But just describe any of that that you want to share.
Yeah, in fact, I did know Speaker Johnson. In fact, he and I sat on steering committees together. So we did become friends, and he's just a great man in terms of he's just so principled and so grounded. And it's you see how it's all playing out. I mean, it is like herding cats, no doubt about it. And I know it's difficult for him to be in this position. It wasn't as if Mike Johnson was advocating or running for this position throughout the conference. And so he's who we've got. I think he's done an admirable job. I think that it's tougher than people realize. And you're trying to appease a lot of different people, make decisions that are going to work for the American people, keep your conference in check, and it's difficult. But I've always appreciated him very much and enjoyed serving with him.
Excellent. Well, let's talk about broadly speaking some more economic related policy issues. And Vasquez, while he's been in Washington, has, I think, tried to make some moderate votes on some issues, but he's also taken some votes on some regulatory policies that will affect everybody's day-to-day lives. Stuff that 5 years ago, 8 years ago, nobody was even talking about. Gas stoves.
Yeah.
And whether you can use a gas stove in your kitchen, gas automobiles. And this is, of course, all coming from the environmental,
Yeah.
side of things. And, in the past, of course, your district, because of the oil and gas industry in southeast New Mexico, was very responsive to that industry. Then Eagle split up that area of the state in order to minimize their political power. So,
Right.
talk about some of those votes. And I don't think I need to ask you where you stand on gas stoves and gas vehicles, but if you want to share exactly what your thoughts are on those and other related issues, that would be great.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, Paul, that we have the number two energy producing, state in the nation. It provides over 50% of our state's budget, and all three of our congressional delegation voted no on the American Energy Act. And this is what's fascinating. Here we produce more affordably, cleaner, better, than any other country in the world. And if it's really all about environment, then why not promote and advocate for clean energy production like oil and gas in New Mexico and other American states instead of going to our adversarial nations that don't have the same environmental regulations that we have. But it's sad. But he's missed the mark on what's important to New Mexicans, and it really doesn't matter the party. People want clean, affordable energy. Parents want to have a say in their kids' education. He voted no on the Parents' Bill of Rights. He voted no to deport a criminal that kills an illegal that kills a police officer. And you're right, on the wrong side of the gas stove. When you look at all these things, these are not the principles that are important to the people of New Mexico. And that's why I think that it is an unfortunate time that we don't have at least one conservative voice advocating on behalf of energy, oil and gas. He's very engaged in these land grabs, these monument designations. This is taking land out of the hands of farmers, ranchers, and then utilizing it to benefit this 30 by 30, which I know you're familiar with, and probably your audience is, that 30% ownership of land and water by the federal government by the year 2030. These are terribly frightening situations when you're advocating to push people. To me, the people that make their living in and around public lands or land in general are the best stewards we have. We've lost our timber industry because of the endangered species. And now Senator Heinrich and Gabe Vasquez are all too happy to take more land away from the people of New Mexico. These are real challenges and very scary propositions. And this is the stuff that is important to me because we don't have a voice. We don't have somebody who's actually calling out what's going on with the 30 by 30, the monument designations, etc. But why aren't we protecting the industries that are so important to New Mexico?
Well, I definitely want to talk about those in a minute. I do want to talk a little bit more about the economy. And, we worked in the legislature on land use issues and land management issues. But a report came out, I believe it was this week, a few weeks ago, from the CBO that federal interest payments now exceed defense spending.
Yep.
And of course, interest payments on the debt are going to rise and rise, both based on the increases of the debt, but also with higher interest rates. And we can talk about inflation as well. But obviously, the nation is on an unsustainable path forward when it comes to the budget. And, New Mexico is a very dependent state when it comes to the federal budget. So talk about that issue and the challenges that we face in right-sizing the federal budget situation.
Yeah, we've got to get this spending under control. We cannot stay on the same path. And you're right. When you think about just the interest payments alone, more than what we spend on our defense, number one, that puts America in a very vulnerable position. Number two, the world is watching this. And when we saw the economy tanking, after COVID, and then we saw inflation just skyrocket and the interest rates have continued to go up. And that's not just interest rates on home loans. It's interest rates on personal loans, on car loans, on everything. And we saw some of that start to come back down. But guess what? The price of goods and services, food, has not come back down. We're still, 7 to 9 percentage points above where we were just 3 years ago. That has a profound impact. That, coupled with the fact that we continue to see burdensome regulation on the backs of our businesses, just like the BOI, the new resolution, or excuse me, rule that Department of Treasury has put into place to register even more of your business with the IRS, actually. But here we are, not really seeing that relief. I mean, and people are starting to realize that these prices aren't falling back down. And so we've got to stop the overspending. And when we saw the number of COVID dollars that were just pushed out to our nation, I get it. COVID was a new thing. Nobody knew what to expect. But when you just start giving every state $1 billion with no oversight, that was one of the ways that kept that inflation just rising. And then not to pull those dollars back in to either pay down on the debt. And we just doubled down and watched this administration overspend. I mean, he has spent more money in new dollars than the president, how many presidents before him. That's why we've got to get a handle on spending. We've got to ensure that we're bolstering our economy, that we start looking at supply and demand, because what else we have to deal with are the policies that the state legislature did. And isn't the one of them the 50 cent tax increase on fuel tax? And so we've got a double whammy going on. We've got overregulation and bad policy coming out of Washington, D.C., coupled with bad policy coming out of Santa Fe. And it's going to be crushing for the people of New Mexico.
Now, certainly, and you won't find me defending Joe Biden and his record. It's been abysmal on inflation and spending, and he's grown government both in terms of overall spending, but also just aggressively regulating and trying to force everybody to just do what he wants. I mean, the vaccine mandates that ultimately went to the U.S. Supreme Court and were, they were said that was too much. It was way too aggressive. But, on spending, President Trump has certainly not got clean hands either. Obviously, if you win, you could be there with President Trump. And I know that's something that you very much would like to see happen. But, are you going to push back against President Trump if he overdoes it in terms of spending? And how do you see that relationship playing out? Because he'll be a lame duck too if he gets there, because he only has the one term.
Yeah. The one thing is, yes, absolutely, we got to push back. I don't care who the president is, because we have not prioritized the people of America, certainly in the last 3 years. But no one that I have talked to can say they're better off than they were 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago. But we can't sustain this. And what I am kind of excited about is people are starting to really think for themselves and see it for themselves. They don't need the media or me or you to say, hey, our economy's bad. They're starting to realize a $1.7 trillion infrastructure bill that only, 0.9 or 9% of it was actually used for infrastructure. That's some of the spending that drives up the cost of inflation. That's not coming back down because there hasn't been any oversight. But we've got priorities, I think, Paul, that we should be, looking at. If we're going to spend money, how about we spend money on our veterans? How about we ensure that they have the services, the medical services, the behavioral health, the services that they deserve? But we're not doing that right now. Let's make sure that our defense is bolstered in terms of spending. We've created such a vulnerability for America. And you're right, he overspent as well. And it's time that we really get serious about buckling down, but nobody wants to do it. It's kind of like putting toothpaste back in the tube. I think we need reforms on our welfare reforms. I think we need to participate in a hand up program, but not a handout program. We have a lack of workforce. We don't have qualified workforces around the country and in some places in New Mexico. That's harmful for our small businesses. It's harmful for our economic development, our free markets, the way our GDP is reflected by how our businesses are performing. There are so many things we could be doing to bolster the strength of this nation, but it starts with cutting this overspending in Washington, D.C. There's been no oversight. And then to try to claw it back is absolutely virtually impossible.
All right. Well, let's get back to the lands management issue and your vast differences between yourself and Gabe Vasquez on how we manage and how much of our land gets locked up. Certainly, uh, the Oregon Mountains. There was a large swath of Oregon Mountains
Right.
land put aside under a national monument designation. Now there is, I think, 400,000 plus acres that's being considered. Also in the CD2
Yeah.
in the Deming area, Luna County, and I haven't seen necessarily Vasquez as the cheerleader in the front of this, but you know that he is very much in the background of this process, and that's what I want to talk to you first about is the process associated with the Antiquities Act and this legislation, this law that goes back to the time of Teddy Roosevelt, and how it resulted in a situation where now one person, the President of the United
Yeah.
States, can lock up huge tracts of land without Congress, without support from local actors. Is that something that you would be interested in tackling? Is reforming that so there's more buy-in? Talk about the process, but behind locking up all these lands.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I think again, like everything, these executive orders and everything, utilizing the Antiquities Act was, I think, really reserved for a very unique and special privilege, if you will. And you're correct in that the president does not need congressional approval to do it. However, this particular president, the Biden administration, has certainly taken advantage of utilizing the Antiquities Act. And I think if they do end up getting this designation done in Luna County, I believe that's like the sixth or eighth designation he'll have done in this administration so far in 3 years. But it's unfortunate that there isn't more buy-in from the people that are living in and around these swaths of land. And then you've got that coupled with your, your wilderness area designations or your proposed wilderness areas. And what people on the eastern side of the country don't realize is for Western states where we have a great deal of natural assets in terms of timber, oil, gas, mining, all these things, it really pushes our people off the land, especially those who've utilized the lands to make a living. And you're right. Gabe Vasquez has been not the cheerleader in front of the line, but certainly hasn't stood up against this. He and Senator Heinrich are very much in favor of pulling back those public lands and putting them into those designations. I mean, I find it fascinating that after they make the announcement that there's a proposed designation on the table, that Gabe Vasquez puts out a survey saying, do you support the monument designation and would you vote for me if I support it? I mean, who even does that? You know where your loyalties lie. They're not to the people of the second congressional district. They're to the environmentalists and to Martin Heinrich and to this administration who's using both the 30 by 30 platform and the Antiquities Act beautifully to remove more land out of public space that really compromises our ability to tap into those natural assets.
Yeah, well, he doesn't need to take a stance because this issue essentially is kind of something that the president can do by
Yep.
themselves, and they can do it after they lose an election. So if Biden were to lose, he could, on his way out the door in whatever January, sign a monument designation. That's certainly not the way it should be.
Yeah, the one thing that Congress could do, and they still have time to do it, is to remove the funding from these monument designations. That wouldn't take them away completely, but it certainly would buy some time. But I think you're right. This is going to have to be addressed because I think by utilizing these designations for monuments, for wilderness study areas, for wilderness areas, all of these things, coupled with the Wild and Scenic River Act or, some bill that Heinrich introduced. I mean, these are land grabs, and we can't afford to keep seen our American people and our farmers, ranchers, and others that utilize these lands pushed off. So, absolutely, that should be a huge priority, especially again for the people in the western states that utilize these public lands and who, by the way, are the best stewards of these lands. No better than the people in Washington, D.C., who've never set foot in New Mexico, what's best for these natural resources and these lands.
And again, you in the legislature worked on lands issues and
Yep.
tried to study and address the way federal lands are managed because, quite frankly, the federal government does a lousy job. We saw that
Yep.
in northern New Mexico, not in your district, but not this past summer, but the previous summer with Calf Canyon and some of these other
The
big
fires.
fires
Yeah.
that were started by the federal government. So just touch on some of the things that you studied and why the federal government does such a poor job of managing these assets to begin with.
The obvious reason, Paul, I think, is because they're listening to these special interest environmentalist groups that don't have a clue. I mean, we lost an entire timber industry back in the 70s because of the Endangered Species Act, because of the spotted owl. And now look at the condition of our forests. It's not if they're going to go up, it's when. And you're right. 2 years ago, we saw a catastrophic loss in New Mexico because of the fire. There's no forest management. When I was in the state house as a state representative, 3 years in a row, I introduced the transfer of public lands so that we could utilize our own resources and our own counties and our own state government to manage these huge blocks of forest, these lands, so that we could get the most bang for our buck. And of course, the one year that we had, the governor's office and we had the majority in the House, and then the Judiciary Committee killed it. And it's sad because then we could have kept those resources here. We could have, re-implemented our timber industry responsibly, of course. I think we could have taken better care of our assets than the federal government is. But now you've got the environmentalists that are calling the shots on everything. And look what they're doing with endangered species and heavy regulation and NEPA studies and everything else. It's impossible to navigate the system, and we need to have a better system put into play and certainly a better management system. But they don't play by their own rules.
Yeah, no doubt about that. So kind of moving back to process and the politics in Washington, um, just coming up on my Yahoo News feed is that, according to ABC News, a deal was reached to avoid partial government shutdown on Friday. Um, one of the things, it's been a challenge for sure. Speaker Johnson, he's probably had a lot of sleepless nights
Yeah.
because he's dealing with basically a couple seat
Yeah.
majorities from the Republican side in the House, and obviously that is going to be an ever-present issue. Just the ability to get things done. Obviously, you win, you give them another vote in Congress, but
Right.
uh, we are split very evenly as a nation. Does seem that large numbers of people dislike Joe Biden, but we thought that 2 years ago, and that didn't exactly create the red wave that a lot of folks were looking for.
Yeah.
Just talk about the process and how difficult it is to get anything done in Washington right now with such a even split up there, and how your one seat, which may seem like a relatively minor thing in the grand scheme of the nation, but how every seat does matter in the House.
Yeah, every seat absolutely matters, but so does every single voice. And I think, again, we've moved away from real governance, from truly representing the people. I wish we had term limits both on the federal level and the state level, because I think that's one of the problems. We've kind of moved away from the will of the people to the will of the special interest group, or, looking at some of the members. Everybody in Congress gets paid the same amount of money, Paul, except those that are getting those insider trading secrets and able to make purchases on the stock market, before Joe Q Public even knows about it. But, it's becoming where the people of New Mexico and the people of America, the greatness of our nation, is kind of been pushed to the back burner. And I think when we're placating to our adversaries around the globe, asking them to, deliver energy for us, when we're leaving our borders wide open, allowing who knows who to come into this country and then receive a gift, basically, housing, food, clothing, whatever they need, education, for breaking the law to come. What other country in the world even does that? So I think we have to get back to basics. I think it's about relationships with the people that we want to represent. I think it's about keeping them engaged and getting their opinion on things and not letting the special interest groups or the powers that be make the decisions. I mean, here's what's scary to me. You've got small businesses across this great nation that are really the backbone of our economy, and you've got a number of people on different levels of government that are making policy decisions that have never signed the front of a paycheck. They've never been a boss. They've never understood the importance, the stress, the liability. They don't understand what it means to own a business and try to keep people employed. And yet here they are making policy decisions, and it's become so political. It's not about people anymore. It's becoming so much about politics. And I think, and I hear this from people around the district and around the state, we don't have a lot of time left to bring this nation back to a place where there's cohesion. We're not where we were after 9/11, where we stood united as a nation. It's very divided. And sadly, we spend 90% of our time fighting over 10% of the things that divide us, instead of coming together and unifying around the 90% of the things that we can all agree on. We want safe environment. We want safe communities. We want a secure border. We want to be able to afford groceries or gas. And it's about laying down that pride and about these attitudes and really coming together for the greater good and not letting social media and the mainstream media drive the narrative.
All right. Well, we've got to wrap up in just a second. I'm going to ask you
Oh,
one more question,
okay.
and it is, kind of on a personal note. Are there Democrats that you interacted with in Washington, setting aside policy differences, but along those lines in terms of bipartisanship, people that you felt like you could work with on policy, or that you just enjoyed interacting with? Because I agree. That the partisanship is really bad, and it seems like our New Mexico delegation uh, is really very, very bad. I follow, especially Melanie Stansbury, her social media account. It's very performative. She is very much a shrill, just screeching consistent leftist voice. Uh, I you would be a breath of fresh air in
Yeah.
New Mexico's congressional delegation, but are there Democrats that you actually find you can get along with?
Yeah, there really are, I think, some good ones in Washington, D.C. The sad thing is, Paul, it's become so, politicized and political. It's kind of lockstep, voting with Nancy Pelosi, voting with Biden. Sadly, our delegation is ultra progressive. Gabe's the same way. I mean, when you're at a rally that has signs that says no borders from Palestine to Mexico, walls gotta go. I mean, that is the true Gabe Vasquez, and that is absolutely frightening. But there are good Democrats in office. There are great people all over the place. We've just got to find the political will to come together and not be afraid to reach out and reach across the aisle and say, hey, you know what? We've got some ideas that could work for the people of New Mexico or the people of America. But we've allowed, again, the narrative to be driven by mainstream media or the forces that be in terms of social media, instead of actually thinking about the people first. And that's why I think this election in 24 will really be about the character, the moral character of our country, but also our ability to just put those differences aside. That's why I said it's sad that we'll let 10% of the issues divide us when 90% of the issues are things we can find common ground in. And we've got to be more bold and step out of our comfort zone and be ready to have people from both sides of the aisle, or whether it's independent, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter. It really ought to be about people over politics. And we've allowed the skew to go so far left. It's time we come back to the middle, where we can actually have real conversations and find solutions that work for the people of New Mexico.
Any specific Democrat names you want to throw out there for People, even
Henry
if you don't
Quay. I
agree
mean,
with them policy
no,
wise,
not
just
yeah. Henry Cuellar,
okay.
was somebody who I very much enjoyed talking to, and he's actually a lot more moderate. Um, there, like I said, there's some good people, but the one thing that was, I think, more difficult for me when I was in Congress is that's right in the heat of COVID. So if you'll
Sure.
recall, Nancy Pelosi did not allow us to bring any family members, one person to our swearing in. They kept the two. I think this was by design. They kept the two parties very isolated and separated. Where I had heard that generally there were a lot more, kind of like in New Mexico, where there were some committee meetings or different receptions where everybody would show up. And that's how you build those relationships with people across the aisle. In Washington, D.C., that really didn't get to happen because of the whole COVID and the mask mandates and then the fencing and all these things that were happening. But I certainly, I'm not a shy person, so I always enjoyed talking to people on the other side of the aisle. And in the committees, we got, excuse me, a little bit more, quality time to spend together. But certainly there was an agenda.
All right. Well, fair enough. And you gave me a name. That's all I was asking for.
Sure.
So thank you, Representative Harrell. And thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.